Hey everyone, welcome again to the Product Podcast. I'm here with Christina Wodtke, who is an author of multiple books, also a lecturer at Stanford. In a previous life, she was a product leader as well. So we're going to talk about a lot of different things. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be talking to you.
I remember the first time I saw you in an in-person conference, when that was a thing. You were probably the most charismatic speaker out there, and I loved your candor, and I loved how you would deliver your message. I'm excited to have you now one-on-one so we can have more of a personal conversation. Let's start from the beginning. Why don't you tell us a bit more about kind of how you started thinking about how you broke into product. I know that you work in product at LinkedIn, but then a bit more in your career, how you started thinking about building high-performing teams and eventually writing books and then teaching about it at Stanford.
Yeah, well, I definitely took the scenic route. I don't know if you know this, but I went to art school and I moved to San Francisco and painted and waited tables for years. And then the internet came along and I just fell in love so hard. I was like, oh my gosh, this is the most amazing, creative, terrific thing I've ever seen. So taught myself some HTML, taught myself JavaScript when it showed up, CSS when it showed up. I've lived on most of those early technologies arriving. And I started asking myself a question. Why are so many products kind of crappy, And so I was like, well, here I am, first I was an engineer, then I was a designer, then I was an information architect. And I thought, well, maybe it's the product manager. So I got into that and I was like, well, maybe it's the management. So I got into that. And eventually as a general manager, I was high enough to see everything. I could see the CEOs, I could see the board. And I was like, it's not the role you have. It's not the power you have. It's how everything connects. And that's when I started becoming much more interested in how do we communicate effectively. There's an old saying that product managers get things done with influence, not authority. And I think that's a big, big piece of the puzzle. So how do we communicate effectively? And you can't trick people because you're going to work with them for 2 or 3 years. So you actually have to create meaningful relationships and really get everybody pointed in the same direction. And that led me to OKRs, to the empowered team model that I have a team that manages itself. Even the drawing book is about communication and being great at communication.
That's really interesting because I kind of came to a similar realization. I come from an engineering background as well. And I realized that I started getting more responsibilities and interacting with people. It was less about the technology and more about the interactions with humans. And I was lacking some of those frameworks. I'm curious to know how you develop your own frameworks. Like, how do you start kind of picking things that you think could work for different teams?
Well, I was one of those kids in 7th grade who tried to read every single book in the library. So, I love books. I love reading. And so I read really, really fast. And so I basically read everything I could find on these questions about product management. David Bradford's wonderful book, Influence Without Authority. Lately, Amy Edmondson's wonderful Fearless Organization. I always think of my work as a mystery. And so I'm always looking for clues, what's a clue to figure out how this works? And what's interesting to me anyway, I hope to your listeners as well, is I would gather this information, whether it be from a pop book or from a scientific paper, and try to figure out how does it all hang together. And it wasn't until I started trying to figure out how do I make good diagrams, how do I make good models, I was able to start developing frameworks. It was almost like I needed an entirely different language to even understand for myself, much less be able to communicate with others. So I spent a year while my editor was recovering from cancer, just working on learning how to draw and then working on writing a book about communicating through very simple, ugly drawings. I'm not going to make you draw beautiful things, but I am going to help you communicate. And then when I came back to Team That Managed Itself, I had this kind of superpower, I guess, of being able to understand how all the elements of a good model hook together and how to draw it and how to share it with other people. And so I've considered just part of my learning process. You ask questions, you figure out who has the answers, you learn from them, and then you integrate it to your own style.
Love it. And I think the fact that you've been doing this throughout your entire career, you said you taught yourself how to code, you're an artist, you're a communicator, those are things that, you jump in, and I think there is no replacement for that. But I also appreciate now kind of taking a step back and and trying to help that next generation. I think one of the reasons why we wanted to start a community for product managers is because there was no community, and we were all trying to reinvent our own wheel. So I'm just curious, from your own book, so when you built that first book, when you wrote that first book, who do you think was going to be the audience, and who is reading you now?
So I think you'll appreciate this. So I had gone to graduate school for writing, and I failed. I wrote this book that was so boring that even I was bored by it, and I couldn't finish writing it. So, flash forward, whatever it is, 10 years forward. And I think, hey, this OKR thing is pretty cool. I would love other people to know about it because I think it could help people. Who wants to read a book about an acronym? Let's be honest. Like, oh my gosh, they weren't popular then. And I was like, okay, I've got to find some way so people will actually be interested in learning about this stuff. So I studied, like I said, read tons of books, figured out how to write a decent story. And then, like a good lean person, I made a little prototype. I wrote a 75-page version of it. It was called The Executioner's Tale. It was ugly. It had a cover designed by one of my students. I printed it at a local print shop, and I sold 100 copies, signed and numbered. There's 100 people out there who have a copy of it, and got their feedback and learned. And it was fun because as I got towards the end of the 100, I think it was like $5 if you bought the first 10, and then the next ones were $10, and I started to find the price point for it. But the feedback blew my mind because I had this picture in my head that I had to write like a 200-page book or 150-page book. And everybody kept saying, I love that it's so short. I love that I can read this in a couple hours on a plane ride, So I ended up, taking all that feedback and putting it into the first Radical Focus. So I guess it's just like everything, The only thing I did that had no testing that was kind of crazy were the illustrations in the front. I was like, people seem to like these drawings. I think I'll throw them in. And then later I thought, wait a second, are people going to think it's a kid's book? But people have really enjoyed the book. So I'm happy. It worked out.
And I know that you released the second edition of Radical Focus. So let's talk about it. What are some of the highlights of the book for people who haven't read it yet? Okay,
so number one, no cascading. You can only do cascading if you have like 12 or 15 people in your company. Just don't cascade your OKRs. It goes to an alignment model where if the company sets them at the top, everybody decides, all the groups, product groups, decide what their OKRs are going to be. And then you do a quick peer review with a couple other people just to, figure out if you're crazy or not. And then you have to trust people. And this is a lot more effective because empowering people is how you keep your A players. You hire the best people you can find, then you trust them to get things done. And it's a very big change, and it's a very, very important change. So once you've got the company OKR set, everybody just figures out their own, and you just trust it's going to work. And then if something goes sideways, you dive in and coach. That's a big change. And Marty Kagan, I don't know if you've had him on your show or not, but he and I have been in conversation for, I guess, 5 years because he wrote the foreword to the first book, and we've been going back and forth about what makes good teams work and what makes bad teams work. And we've both come to the same conclusion, which is hire great people and trust them. It's pretty simple. And then the OKRs are more there to make sure that people are aligned. They know what the most important things are. And then there's other things like talking a little bit about things like pipeline. Sadly, as I've been consulting here and there between my day job work, I've seen people try to use OKRs for everything, and they're not. They're not to do everything. They really have one specific job, and they're not for people management. They're not for controlling every single effort you're doing. They're about making sure that the critical strategic work that you have to get done actually gets done. And this is a very radical and different point of view than certainly what the software makers want you to think. And a bit different than I think the other books that are out there. There's like 2 now, I think, after mine was written.
Yeah, and I'm a believer in OKRs, but I have to admit that it's been challenging to, first of all, implement them at an executive level and then try to make sure that there's some buy-in. So I want to ask you a very tactical question. Imagine a product team whose company is not really following OKRs, or maybe there's some OKRs, but they are so far away that they don't really apply to what they do on a weekly or monthly basis. Like, how can a product team create some sort of goal or objectives for them to know that they are aligned?
Yeah. I think the important thing is to step back first and figure out what's the big picture of everything, right? So I talk about the fact that I prefer and I recommend using pipelines instead of roadmaps. So roadmap, for semantic purposes, I'll just clarify what I say. Roadmaps are a list of things you plan to do. A pipeline is a list of things you could do with evaluation about how hard it's going to be, what kind of impact you think you're going to be, and how much confidence you have in that it's actually going to work. And then once you've set these goals that are objective, which is inspiring, and then the key results, which are outcomes. There are numbers out there in the world that will change if you're successful. So they can't be tasks. They can't say, oh, my OKR is to find a nice low-cal snack. I think I'll just go down to Trader Joe's and see what they got. No, that's a task. I think we're going to launch 20 blogs this year. Well, it's got a number, but guess what? There's no outcome. What you want to do is look for things that are like cold leads are awesome because people are hearing about you. Or revenue, nobody lies with their wallet. Revenue is usually a decent sign that something's working. It could be time on site. There's just so many good numbers that you can use. You can even get at the quality numbers with a little bit of effort. So I think what happens is if let's say you're a product lead, leading a team, or even managing a larger product group like a business unit lead, you're going to have all the things you have to do, right? Like keeping the lights on. That's all stuff that has to happen. And then you have all the things you're worried about. When you're trying to do amazing things, you want to make sure you're not writing bad code that's going to crash. You don't want your people to get burned out because it's very expensive to, lose people and have to rehire them and have to train them. And finding great people is really hard. Great people are always hard to find, even in the worst economy, because they're great. So maybe you want to protect team health. And then the question is, what's the thing we really should be doing this quarter that we'll forget to do because of firefighting, right? Or craziness. And that way you take something that's from the old Eisenhower matrix, where it's important, not important, urgent, and not urgent. You take all those important and not urgent things, and you say, we're going to set an OKR around it. And this quarter, we're actually going to do it. We're not going to wait for tomorrow anymore. And so that can be lots of things. And I love talking to product managers because they really get this, is we always have these questions like, how do we expand our market? Do we go bring our current product to another market? Do we create a new feature that will appeal to new people within our current market? There's all these strategic questions. So you use an OKR to basically communicate those strategic decisions or measure your hypothesis that you're working on so that you have a higher certainty of knowing whether or not you're going in a good direction. And so the OKRs, because they're inspirational and because they have numbers attached to it, are really good at guiding those efforts. But you have to remember that you still got to do all the other stuff too.
Yeah, and I like what you said about that other stuff, because there's this misconception in product, which is about shipping features, right? And that obviously is important, but there are many other things that go with it. It's just technical debt, as you said, hiring key players, maintaining a good team morale. So are you recommending to put some of those objectives as part of the OKR?
No, only one OKR, and it's only for the strategy. You have to trust everything else has to get done. So what I recommend to people is do an inventory of all the stuff you have to do, right? Like, how often do we step back for a minute? And I don't want to say work on a weekend, but like maybe take a Thursday, Friday, block it off, figure out everything that's going on, make yourself a nice big picture of it. Walls are really important for thinking. Because I teach at Stanford, I spend a lot of time looking at psychology and learning science, and it's really useful to be able to have everything right in front of you. That's the reason we started creating Kanban boards, was you need to see everything that's going down, right? So once you see everything that's going on, then you can ask yourself the question of, what do we really have to do to give us the kind of resilience that we need as a company? What do we have to do that's allowing us to grow in a sensible way? And then you make the OKR around that. So I feel like we spend a lot of time trying to manage things that we're going to do anyway. Like in my personal life, I'm going to pay my bills. And if I don't pay my bills, my lights are going off, and then I'll pay my bills. Like it's going to happen. So why would I put an OKR around, remember to pay the utility bills? What I want to do is put in an OKR that says, create a first draft of the next book you want to write on, the creative founder, perhaps. Because if I don't make that OKR, I'm going to be busy answering student calls and going on podcasts like this one and everything else, So how do I make sure that these things that I really know are important are getting done? And I think there's this urge to find the one ring to rule them all. It's like, oh, OKRs, it'll control everything. And no, that's not right. It's a piece of the puzzle. It's not the entire puzzle.
Like that approach. So let's talk about the entire puzzle now, because not just for PMs, but in general, professionals with high responsibility, right? There's a lot of things going on. And your book's title is Radical Focus. So how do you recommend for people to really keep focus and identify what are the top priorities and stick to them?
Yeah. So one of the single most important things is the cadence. So a lot of people think it's all about wordsmithing the perfect OKR. If I can just write the perfect OKR, everything will happen, right? But that leads to set and forget. It's actually okay to have a poorly written OKR, preferably not with tasks and the key results, but maybe it's not perfect. And then every Monday, you have to ask yourself, what am I doing this week to get closer to the results I'm trying to make happen? What is an experiment I can run? What's a task I could do? What's a project I can start? And then every Friday within a company, you celebrate your progress towards the OKRs. And hopefully you write the super lightweight status email that I recommend in the book, where all you do is you say, what confidence do you have we're going to hit the OKRs? And what are the 3 most important things I'm doing next week against them? And what are the 3 things that happened last week that I tried? And what happened? And this is where you get learning. And it's so powerful to say, I tried this last week, but nothing happened. And you write it down and you learn it and you share it. And the company gets smarter and smarter and smarter and more effective. So what's critical to keep your priorities is, I kind of think of it as OKRs as a lucky rock. I know it's a weird metaphor, but if I wrote my OKRs on a rock I find in a river or ocean, and I put them in my pocket, and I always have it in my pocket, and I pull it out and touch it regularly, I'm going to remember that's the most important thing. But instead of a rock, we have the Monday commitments, we have the status email, we have the Friday celebrations.
Mm-hmm. And when you say that you are going to remember what's in that rock, I guess it's not just you, but the idea is that the entire team needs, if you ask the same question without you in the room, that person should be able to give the same answer, right?
Everybody gets a rock.
So I want to ask you, I'm sure that there are a lot of PMs that are listening and getting excited thinking, okay, this seems to make sense. What would be some lightweight ways for people to maybe see some examples of other successful teams or companies implementing OKR so they don't have to go from 0 to 100?
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for talking about lightweight. Almost every conversation I have with companies, they've made it too complicated. It really doesn't have to be that hard. So early on, Gather Content was a great company. Angus Edwardson wrote quite a bit in public. The problem is always going to be finding people writing about in public, because there's always an urge to tell everybody how amazing and awesome you are. So go through those, but maybe with a grain of salt. If you Google around, you can find lots and lots of examples. I will say one great thing about the second edition is in the first, I hate writing examples. So I wrote only a few examples in the first book. The second one's got 40 or 50 example OKRs that are all, and maybe 10, 15 negative examples. So I just would love to say, if you're thinking about OKRs, pick one high-performing team to start with. Now, a lot of people are like, OKRs will fix things, so let's start with a bad team, but don't do that, because bad teams are bad and it's going to confuse matters. So you start with a high-performing team, let them work with it for 30 days, let them tell you, I had to change these things to make it work with our cycle, like we do sprint planning on this day or whatever. And then at the end of those 3 months, if it's been successful, then you can start rolling it out to a few more pilot people. But again, lightweight, one OKR for that group, and then don't worry about anything else and see what happens. I think we spend too much time preparing and not enough time learning. So what you want to do is learn as quickly as possible, but then also make it a small enough scope so if things go sideways, you can recover from it. companies that roll it out from the top down for the entire company, I have never seen that successful. And not only that, I've never seen it be so-so. I've only seen disasters come out of that. So I'm like, if you're a cool product manager, just start trying it out with your team. Say, hey guys, I want to try this. Let's just do it for one little thing in the corner. Let's see how it plays out.
And how often do you recommend to revisit those OKRs?
Well, I'm a big fan of quarterly cadences because, as Spotify says, it's just long enough to learn something and just short enough that you haven't forgotten what happened. So just, starting it out for one quarter and just doing one OKR, like I said, and everything else can keep going. You've got a roadmap, you've got a pipeline, whatever, and see what you think. That's it.
I want to explore another hot topic related to OKRs, but in general with management, which is feedback delivery. I know that because your talk on that was excellent. So for teams who are working remotely, who have to kind of schedule the interactions with others, and they might not have all the authority, especially in product, right? Just you said leading by influence, but not by authority in many cases. So how do you recommend that teams can implement some sort of social norms to better collaborate and help each other out?
Wow, you threw me to the last sentence. But I will definitely cover all those things. So when I finished Radical Focus, people kept saying, how do we do people management? How do we handle this problem? And I'm like, that's not OKRs, that's something else. And eventually I wrote The Team That Managed Itself to talk about those things. And from the original book, Wisdom of Teams, they talk about goals, roles, and norms. Those are the three things that make companies incredibly successful. So goals, we got OKRs done. But why norms? What do we even mean? A norm is basically how we agree to interact with each other. But the problem is they're often unspoken. And what you want to do is make them clearly spoken so that everybody knows that we have a set of norms. And so you said you're from Spain. I spend part of my life down in Belize. And I will tell you that we're going to meet at 10 o'clock means something completely different at Stanford. It means 10:10 or 10:15 than Belize, which means somewhere in the middle of the morning. And so that's a norm that actually, weirdly enough, can make people really angry and really resentful, right? If you expect somebody to be there at between 10 and 10:15 and they're showing up at 11, you're going to be angry. So by consciously saying, what do we mean by on time? And then there's tons of other things like, how do you want feedback? How would you like me to tell you when I think there's something you're doing that could be better? How do we reach consensus? Do we disagree and then commit? Do we have to reach a true consensus? There's so many questions and everybody has this mental model in their head. So again, when you first gather as a team, you're going to set up norms. And then for the rest of the team's life, you're going to check in with them. You're going to do tiny retrospectives. 10-minute retrospectives is what I recommend. Just saying, okay, here's what we said we were going to do. Is there any experiment we want to run? Do we want to try doing our meetings as a stand-up? Do we want to start meeting 10 minutes early? Whatever wacky thing you want. And the end of the quarter, you have a richer retrospective where you talk about, okay, what have we learned about working together? What do we want to fix? And that's a really, really critical tool just to make sure that everybody's working from the same page and avoiding all those stupid, useless, unnecessary conflicts we don't need. So I want to speak to your first half, which is giving feedback to someone who's maybe violating the norms or perhaps doing something that you're unable to navigate. For example, I kind of lose my mind when people interrupt me, especially if they're guys. So just saying, and thank you for not being that guy. You're lovely. But they don't know, like, what if they're Italian and that's just what we do? We talk on top of each other and we get excited and we're all friends, right? So that's one of those places where I need to say, I like to gather my thoughts, and when you interrupt me, unfortunately interrupts my thoughts. And I'd really like to ask you, is it possible that you could restrain yourself on that? Because unfortunately that makes me sad and uncomfortable. And I feel like I can't say anything around you because you'll jump on me. Like trying to figure out how can I phrase this in a way that it can be heard and we're not making this person a bad guy so that they freak out, but just saying, here's how I'm affected by your words. And I'm wondering if we could do things a little bit differently.
Yeah, and I can say that as an immigrant now living in the US, it took me a long time to understand the different norms in the different cultures, different languages, and even like our own norms as a company. And one of the things that actually changed my life was to realize that it's okay to talk about feelings and it's okay to talk about norms. And words like culture that sounded very like Silicon Valley cool, in reality are absolutely critical. But we used to work in a small room with family and friends, and we assumed that we would all share the same values and norms. And it's only when we got to a different scenario we're like, oh my God, I think we need to put this on paper.
Yes. Although I've discovered since I've started making norms a lot more clear that even my friends are annoyed by me with some of the things I do, and I'm annoyed with them sometimes. And be able, instead of like, when somebody does something and you're like, oh gosh, I don't know how to tell them, and I'm really worried, but I'm really mad at them, and I don't think I can look them in the eye until we talk about this, and you're getting all crazy in your head. If you can practice instead when somebody does something and just say, I'm not really good with that. Get it out really quick before you can get all weird about it. And then if they are a friend, you can talk about it. And if they are more of a colleague and you're not ready, you haven't got your words formed, you can say, would it be okay if I gather my thoughts and come back later? And most people will say yes. So getting used to quickly diving in and not sitting on it and not soaking in it, it's a really good habit to try to develop.
And what would you say to people who are listening and thinking, yes, this is great, and I would love to be able to do it, but you know what? I just joined the company and my title is not global director of something. And I'm afraid that if I try to have an open conversation with my manager, he or she might take it the wrong way. And I've seen, unfortunately, that if that type of behavior happens at the beginning, then it kind of becomes part of the culture and it's really hard to change it later on.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things to say to that. I mean, one is your first job and your first goal in your first 90 days is build social capital, which means you've got to get some wins. You've got to teach people to trust you. You have to let people know that you're not going to be dangerous to them. It means having lots and lots of cups of coffee or tea with everybody you possibly can and just sitting there and listening to them. It's a great, just listening to people is a great way to create social capital because everybody is dying to find somebody who listens to them and really hears them. So those are things I do early. But the other thing I want to point out is I think a lot of people want to get authority from a title, and I have not seen that work. You get authority through your own confidence, your own kindness, your own strength. And that's something that no title is going to give you. So the more you spend time getting to know who you are and learning to love that. And again, we're getting all touchy-feely here. Welcome to Silicon Valley. But Stanford Graduate School of Business, like one of the best business schools in the country, they have a class called Interpersonal Dynamics, and all the students call it touchy-feely. And that it's not required. It's an elective, and everybody takes it. Because the reality is, if you're working with people, you have to kind of get good with you, and you have to get good with other people, and you have to learn how to bridge that gap between their goodness and your goodness.
That was the class I was actually referring to, because Carol Robin, it's been tremendous for us to guide us through this process. And she actually released another book called Connect, which I think it's really cool for people to know that, hey, for $20, you can have access to some of these interpersonal dynamics that I think are really powerful, regardless of your title and your location.
Absolutely. I would also recommend Ed Batista's blog. He taught touchy-feely for years, and he's just an amazing writer. So if anybody's like, $20, I don't have that in my pocket, try the internet.
Well, Christina, it's been an absolute pleasure to learn from you. Thank you for sharing some of those insights with all of us. Is there anything else you would like to add?
I do have something I want to add. It's going to be very touchy-feely, which is one of the things I've noticed with both my clients and my students is that the pandemic's really worn us out, and people are fuzzy-headed, and people are making mistakes, and people are getting crabby. And I think this is an incredibly important time to be kind to people. Be as kind as you can, including yourself, Don't overwork yourself. Don't get mad at yourself if you make a mistake. There's an old saying, which is be kind to everybody you meet because they too are fighting a great battle. We're almost over the finish line. Let's just be kind as we can a little bit longer. And who knows, you might like it. You might keep doing it for the rest of your life.
Love it. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.
Bye.